Hello, it's Deborah from the attic, and I have the July 2019 card kit from Simon Says Stamp, and we're starting with this large glue sponge. I'll show you how to use that before we make our cards. There's a set of 5 foils, and these are ready to be used on these pre-prepared cards. And there's also a lollipop, which is mine. I keep that. This is a beautiful set of papers. They are 6 by 6 in size. I'll flip them over so you can see both sides of these, and they match very nicely with the rest of the kit. There's this lovely honeycomb die. There's also some sequins in yellow and black. There's a white envelope, and as we move on to the stamp, you can see there's lots of very nice little characters and some beautiful sentiments as well. And the core papers at the bottom are in blue, white, black and yellow, and again they match with everything else in the kit. Now before we start our 10 cards, I want to show you the glue sponge. This little corner clips off, that releases the lid, and I've got a plastic glove on because I'm poking down into the glue to get it to come up to the surface, and then you can use it for really intricate little dies such as this hexagon that I'm using at the moment. So this is our first card, and I'm using some washi tape just to hold this die in place because I want to cut out some about 3 or 4 times out of one card so that I have what looks like honeycomb running all the way down the one side of my card. I'm going to use the big sponge to dip my top layer of card into and glue it onto a yellow base, and then I'm taking my hexagon dies, which are very intricate, and I'm using a pokey tool just to push them into the glue, and then I'm finding their position in the cutout shape and gluing them down onto my yellow base card. While my card dries, I'm going to take some of the little bee characters and I'm going to put several of them on a stamp block, and I'm going to use some Simon Says Stamp clear detail embossing powder. I'm going to ink these up using black ink, and then I'm going to cover the first half of this card with the embossing powder, and then I'm going to stamp more on the base. A little bit more embossing powder, and then I'll heat set these and they're ready for me to use. And I'm going to cut these out. I quite like fussy cutting, I find it quite restful. I've partly coloured in my bee with an orangey yellow watercolour pen, and the rest of the stripes I've used a black pen. I've added some foam to the reverse so I can glue him down, and I'm going to add the final sentiment with some black ink. And that's our first card complete. Our second card starts in a similar way to the first. I've cut out some shapes and I've reserved the intricate dies that are left, and I've also kept the insides of these, and I'll use them on a future card. I've got one of the foil pieces and I'm going to glue on the reverse of my black card, and then I'm going to stick that down onto the foil. We're going to use the foil without using any heat or anything, we're just going to use it for a background. I'm going to glue my black card down on top of the foil, and then I'm going to cut out the excess. I'm going back to my big glue sponge again, and as before I'm dipping the intricate die pieces in the glue, and I'm finding their position in the space that's left behind and gluing them down directly onto the foil. I'm using my stamp block there just to hold everything down to give it time to glue in place. And that's the completed version. These are 2 of my little characters that I cut out and coloured previously, and I've also got a sentiment here that I'm going to stamp, and I'm going to use some white embossing powder and I'll heat set that, and that will be the sentiment of the card. We belong together. I've got some foam pads on the reverse of these little characters as well, and I'm going to glue them down into position. And now I want to complete the card with some sequins. I'm adding some dots of glue, and I'm going to take a mixture of the yellow and the black sequins, and I'm just going to add them on the background of our card. Sometimes you can make your life a little easier by positioning the stamps that you want to use and then putting a block on top of them and picking them all up together. That's what I've done with this card. My sentiment in the bottom is there so that I can see exactly where I want to position my bee and the little buzz line that the bee has created. So I'm going to put that in first with some black archival ink. Again, I'm going to add some Simon Says Stamp clear embossing powder, and I'm going to heat set that sentiment. That's why I'm doing this part of the card first, because this is the bit I want to have heat set. The rest of the card doesn't require that, it will just be plain black ink. And because I've got these 2 elements on one stamp block together, makes it much easier for me to position them around my sentiment. I have a white china marker pencil, and I'm going to use this to add some white highlighting to the top of my large letters and also to the wings of the bee. I'm going to use a black marker pen to colour in the nose of the bee and also some of the little stripes on its body. This card is only going to be black, white and yellow. I've cut down a piece of black card that came from the kit, and when I mount this onto the top of that, my card is complete. For my next card, I'm using a sheet of the beautiful blue paper that came in the paper pack, and I'm also using some of the hexagon stamps. Now I'm inking these up with a very soft grey because that will push them back into the background of this card. I don't want them to be in the foreground, I just want them to create a little bit of texture and a little bit of context for the sentiment. I'm using the tiny hexagon stamp to fill in some of the gaps, and I've got a little piece of paper protecting my desk so I don't stamp onto it. Do you remember the black hexagons that we kept from earlier when we did some die cutting? Well, I'm going to use my nice big glue sponge to position these on some, not all, of the hexagon spaces, and where they overlap my card I'm just going to cut them away. This way, when I mount them onto the plain blue card, they don't interfere with that frame. Now I have my sentiment and I'm using black ink to ink this up, and I hope you'll see what I mean about using the grey to let elements disappear into the background. I'm using it again for some tiny little hearts, and I'm going to link the hearts into the hexagons, and that will pull the whole design together so that sentiment isn't left just floating free. Finally, for this card I want to take some of my black sequins and add some tiny little dots to the hexagons. I'm going to stick the sequins inside the hexagons, and that will just make them have a little flash of something glittery and shiny. And when they're glued down, our card is complete, and I think that's a nice grown-up looking card. For my next card, I've taken a piece of the yellow hexagon paper from the pack and I've cut it in half so that I've put the darker piece at the top and the lighter piece at the bottom, so that way it looks as if that graduation of colour extends even further down the card. I've got a piece of white cardstock, and again I've pre-mounted some of the stamps onto one of my stamp blocks. This way I know they will go down exactly where I want them to go. I'm using a Simon Says stamp clear embossing ink pad, and I'm inking these up because I'm going to use white heat embossing again to really make these elements pop. I'll sprinkle this over and then maybe you'll be able to see what the design is. I've used two phrases. I've taken sweet and mommy to be, and I've put them on top of each other. Now I have a piece of craft foam at the reverse. I use craft foam a lot as a 3D element. I find it's better and more manageable than using double-sided sticky foam pads. So I've added this to the reverse. This will make this stand out just a little bit from the background. I'm going to bring my stamp block back in and place it on top of everything that's been glued. That will give it some weight and help everything stick. Now I'm adding some tiny dots of glue, and again I'm going to add some of the sequins to make the card just have a little bit of a flash to it. And that's our card complete. Very, very simple and very quick. For my next card I want to do something a little bit more intricate. I want to add some of these words into that sort of whiz line left by the bee. This means I have to cut them in half, and I'm going close in. I hope that you can see I'm cutting these letters apart, but I'm not going to lose the sentiment. I could put them back together and use them as they were originally intended if I want to do that. I'm going to place them down on my card in where I want them, and then I'm going to pick them up on my stamp block. I'm going to ink these up and make sure that the words come out nicely, and they do. So you can see I'm going to have my card saying be awesome, and it's going to fit in this part of the whiz line. Now this means that I need to hide that part of the whiz line stamp to allow my words to go in there. I could have cut the whiz line, but I didn't really want to do that. So I'm going to show you a different method. I have a little scrap of white paper, and I'm going to position this under the whiz line so that when I ink and stamp that little curvy whiz line, that part of my card will remain blank. I'm going to use a little bit of repositionable tape to hold that white piece of scrap in place. Then I'm going to get my long block, and I'm going to ink this piece up. I'm also going to add a little piece of white paper to the left just to protect my the mat that I'm working on, and then I'm going to add my inked up line and you will be able to see when I take this away that it's left a gap on the yellow card underneath. Then if I remove the white paper and I just rub away that repositionable tape, I can bring in my words. So the words were already on the block, and I just need to add some black ink and stamp them down into position. I'm adding my little bee at the end of its whiz line, and now I want to add some coloured paper at the top of this card to make it a little bit more interesting. So I've got two little strips of paper. One is narrower than the other one. I'll cut off the excess, and then I have this honey coloured ribbon that I found that I thought would be a nice way to complete this card. So I'm going to cut a length of this and tie a little bow. Finally, I'm going to colour in my little bee, and I'm using an orange Copic marker and a little black marker, and as always I've coloured in the bee's nose. I didn't know bees had noses. I think it's quite cute to colour that in. Our next two cards are going to make use of the foil that came in the kit, and these cards that I'm placing the foil on top of are ready prepared to take the foil on top if you heat it. So I've folded one of these into a piece of glassine paper. I've run it through my laminator 2 or 3 times, and when I peel it away I get this beautiful effect. I'm going to put this one to one side. We're going to come back to this one and do something with that, but the next card I want to show you completed is the blue and the green, which I'm also going to run through my laminator 2 or 3 times. I'm going to peel this away, and I'm going to show you that you don't have to waste the foil that's come away. You can use that to create quite an interesting background. So I've got a piece of white card for my base, and I'm using the glue sponge to glue the foil that's left over from the original lamination into position over the top of that, and I'm going to trim away the excess so that the background is completely foiled. Now I'm going to add some glue to the reverse of the card that we did actually add the foil to, and I'm going to position that on top, and this way it looks as if your card is die cut. It's quite a nice effect. And that's our card complete. That's all you need to do. It's very, very simple. For this card, I wanted to show you a different way that you could use it, and I liked the sentiment. So I'm cutting out the sentiment. I'm also going to cut out a couple of these little bees, and I'm going to use those on future cards. This card, I've used a piece of paper from the pack for my base, and I've mounted that little sentiment onto a piece of yellow card or yellow paper from the pack again, and I've glued it at a slight angle onto a blue background. Now I want to make this a little bit sort of rough and ready, so I'm going to staple these into position. So it's only the stapler that's going to add an extra element, an extra dimension to this. And then my bee, and this is one of the bees that we foiled and that I cut out. I've added foam pads to the back of the bee. I'm going to add another staple, and that's my card finished. And it's a great way to use those cards in a different way. For card 9, this is a technique I used some time ago, and I've got the hexagon die and I've got a black marker pen, and I am just scribbling through each of these little individual hexagons. I'm going to build up the design from the centre all the way out, and you'll see as it goes out to the outside edges of the card it's a little bit more faded. I've added less and less lines as I've gone further outside the card. I've got one of my bees again from the card that we used for foiling, and I've also got a sentiment prepared. Before I add the sentiment, I'm going to add some little sort of whiz line border effects. I'm going to do 2 lines, and then I'm going to glue everything down into position. I haven't added foam pads to my bee this time. It's just going to be quite a flat card. I'm going to complete the wings on my bee with an aqua shimmer gold coloured pen. And that's the card finished. My final card is going to be a shaker card. So I've got one of the nice yellow pages from the pack, and I've cut out a circle, and I'm going to turn the circle around, and I'm going to use the other side of that paper because it's got some nice hexagon shapes in the background, and I thought it'd be a shame not to use those. I've got my glue sponge, and I'm using that to glue all of my elements into place. Then I've cut out a circle using my round die cuts. I've cut the circle from some of the cream paper. And I've also added a little bit of laminator pouch. This is laminator pouch that's been laminated, so it's nice and rigid. And I've glued that onto the inside of my circle, and now I'm going to use my craft foam again. So these are very thin strips of craft foam which I've cut, and the reason I like using these, especially for shaker cards, is because they're pliable. So I can make these go around my circle with no worry that any of the sequins that will be contained within the circle can escape. It's a good idea to use a stamp block or anything else that has weight to help you glue these into position, but actually they glue quite easily and it's not too fiddly. And then as soon as you get to the end of your circle, you just cut off any excess and you know you've got a perfect fit. I actually ended up using the glue sponge box to help me hold things into position. It's got nice weight in it. So now that that's prepared, I can add my sequins into the middle. I'm going to add quite a generous amount of these because I think they're very jolly. Then I'm going to pat them down so I know that they're not going to stick up and be captured within my circle and not be able to move. So keep them flat and then they'll be able to swirl around quite easily. I've added some glue to the inside circle and I've glued that into position, and I'm using again my heavy sponge box to hold that down. Here are two of my little characters that I cut out earlier on as well, and I'm going to glue those directly onto the see-through Perspex-y stuff. So they're going on top, they're not going inside. Then those two little, the little black pieces of craft foam are what was left over from going around my circle, and I've glued those onto the reverse of a sentiment. And our card is complete. I'm going to say thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your time, as always. I'm going to leave you with a little music and some close-up of all the cards that we've made today. And until we meet again, take care.